You're listening to the SSPX podcast, and welcome to episode 40 of the Crisis in the Church series. So we have 10 or so episodes left of this series. Over the last 39 episodes, we've seen the history of the crisis, the events leading up to Vatican II, the council itself, the aftermath of the council, and in the last set of episodes, we've seen the errors facing faithful Catholics as a result of all of this. Now we're going to get into the response to the crisis, the traditional Catholic movement. And we certainly can't talk about this movement without talking about the Society of St. Pius X. But before we start talking about the history, which we'll do next week in episode 41, we have to look at the mission, the reason. What are the guiding principles behind the SSPX? What led Archbishop Lefebvre to make certain decisions that he did about the organizational structure? He could have done 100 different things. Why this? We're happy to welcome Father Stephen Reed to explain this for us right now on the SSPX podcast. Well, welcome to the SSPX podcast and our next episode on the Crisis in the Church series. And we're welcoming for the first time in this series, Father Stephen Reed. Hello, Father. How are you?
Hello, Andrew. I'm doing well. How are you?
Very good. You are joining us kind of at the tail end of this whole series. So for people who may not know who you are or what you do, can you give us a little bit of a insight as to who Father Reed is?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Father Stephen Reed. I was ordained in 2015 at Winona by Bishop Tissi de Malaray. I have been stationed various places. It's my third assignment. I'm currently in St. Mary's, Kansas, and I work under Father Rutledge, and I am the principal of the girls' school here in St. Mary's.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat with us. This is a little bit of a lull between school starting. We're recording this here mid-August, so the rubber's going to hit the road pretty quick for you. But
Oh yeah.
Thanks anyway for taking the time away from your preparations.
Yeah.
We are starting kind of the next whole section of this crisis series with you, Father. We've been talking all the way from nominalism and Luther to modernism to the new theology to Vatican II to then some of the more modern issues. Sedevacantism, is Pope Benedict still the Pope? All of these issues we've been talking about from the crisis. And excuse me, we've been talking about it almost in terms of our society priests kind of being outsiders looking at the topics. Now we're going to look a little bit more introspectively at the Society of St. Pius X itself. So for this next whole section, because we can't really talk about the crisis in the church without talking about the traditional movement, and we can't talk about the traditional movement without talking about the Society of St. Pius X. So all that to say, we're going to be talking with you today about the Society of St. Pius X in terms of its mission. We're going to get into the history of the Society of St. Pius X in our next episode, but let's take kind of a broad perspective of the SSPX. What's the purpose? What's the reason? Can you give us some introduction as to the SSPX and the role in the crisis and the role that it plays in the Catholic Church as a whole?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think, there's no doubt that, the SSPX plays, certainly we see it playing a very important role in the life of the Church, although it's not very well known. And that's often, when we do come in contact with clergy or bishops, usually the response is, well, who are you? Like, where do you come from? What are you doing? There's a lot of people who don't know what the SSPX is at all. And I think even amongst our faithful, so those who attend our masses, there's definitely an understanding that, okay, well, the SSPX it provides a Latin Mass, it provides the sacraments, it's something I want, it's something I treasure, but they often don't know sort of like really the particulars, like really what is the SSPX, like what is it for? There's no doubt that the SSPX is playing a role in, obviously in defending and upholding, the sana doctrina, the healthy doctrine of the Church, perennial doctrines of the Church, and expressing that, of course, through the Latin Mass and everything else connected to that. But, I think to really sum it up in just like one sentence, and this could be the whole podcast. What is the purpose of the SSPX? What's the point? Well, it's the priesthood. and all that pertains to it. That's basically it.
Well,
and that's
for
actually
joining us, Father. We appreciate it.
Yep. All right. I'm going to sign off now. Yeah. No, man, really, that's it. That's the whole thing. And that's actually, that's taken directly from the statutes of the society.
So when we look at the mission of the Society of St. Pius X, it's about the priesthood. So we can't talk about the mission of the Society of St. Pius X without looking at its founder, Archbishop Lefebvre. And again, we'll look at the history in a little bit more detail next episode. But right. Archbishop Lefebvre had this love of the priesthood. Why did he see this as the core principle? What in his story, what in his history made it so that he saw this as kind of the linchpin for the survival of the traditional church?
Yeah. It's something that he himself spoke about at least several occasions, and he wrote about it too. He talks about this dream that he had, and not necessarily sleeping and waking up dream, but like a vision that he had at a specific moment, in time and place, in the cathedral in Dakar, where he was apostolic delegate at the time. He had this vision for sort of establishing a society of priests or fraternity of priests who are faithful to the priesthood, their priesthood, who are all about being priests in the most authentic way possible. And so therefore, to the Mass and to the doctrine that's necessarily a part of that and expressed through the Mass and everything, of course, connected to that. So that's in, it's probably around like the 50s. So this is, middle of the 20th century, sort of in the midst of all of his duties and everything he's doing. He sort of has this idea. This is what the church needs. Because I think already at that time, he's already beginning to see, things are starting to go downhill already in different ways. So that's sort of the very first moment that at least he later explains. But then, of course, and he'll explain it develops over time. And as I've already mentioned, he was the apostolic vicar. He was appointed by Pius XII to represent the Vatican, essentially, in French-speaking Africa. So, West Africa, Madagascar, those areas. His assignment after the death of Pius XII, John the 23rd removed him from that position. And he was made the Bishop of Toul, which is a little teeny tiny diocese in France, where he was appointed just to be the bishop there of that diocese. And in his time there, this is the early 60s, and so already really the church is already starting to go downhill in a very noticeable way, especially in Europe, in France. And so he is sort of coming into this tiny, kind of impoverished diocese, where things are kind of going downhill. Seminaries are emptying. I believe the seminary had been closed when he arrived. Things were going downhill, and he saw it especially in the priests, especially the young priests, priests who were sort of fresh out of the seminaries. He saw that they didn't really seem to understand what they were about. They didn't really seem to understand their role. They had been taught something that was different, and they were, at least as he described it, they were lost. They didn't really know. They felt depressed, basically. And he will describe stories of, speaking to different young priests and encouraging them and different things. But this also sort of sparks for him. He's spent all this time in Africa and maybe a little bit separated from what's going on in the church in Europe. And now he really sees it. It's like, oh, wow, this is a real problem. And then, of course, we have to get into some history here. But his next assignment, and this is right on the cusp of the Second Vatican Council, he's made superior general of his congregation. The Spiritans, or in English usually referred to as the Holy Ghost Fathers. And that is, I believe, in 1962. He's made superior general of his congregation. And then, of course, he's involved in, managing that and traveling all over the world. And, of course, his role is to, manage superiors and priests in the congregation, because it is a priestly congregation. He's certainly, of course, also in the context of the Second Vatican Council, he's seeing what's going on in his own congregation. And by the time, we get to the end of the Second Vatican Council, so the end of the 60s, late 60s, it was probably around like 1967, 68, the congregation wants to modernize. The Second Vatican Council calls for an updating of religious congregations. And so, of course, the men in his congregation are like, okay, we need to do this. We need to modernize. And they want to sit down and go, okay, we need to make all these changes. And there are two different minds here. And eventually he realizes that, nobody's going to listen to him in his congregation. And so he resigns. He leaves his post as Superior General of the Spiritans, and he retires. He's about 63 years old at that time.
It's interesting to me, Father, and jump in if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, or maybe I'm putting too much emphasis or symbolism where it doesn't exist. But there's really kind of three main parts in the life of Archbishop Lefebvre before the Society of St. Pius X, and that is he's in Africa and he's overseeing schools and seminaries, right, in French-speaking Africa. Right. And then he's overseeing the Diocese of Toul, and then he's overseeing the Holy Ghost Fathers. And in all of these roles, he is, in one way or another, managing other priests. He has this management capacity, I guess you could say in modern terms, but probably this love of helping priests, of overseeing priests and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. No, it's true. And in fact, so he was a parish priest in France for, I think, just about 2 years. His older brother, René, was a Spiritan. And he was sort of encouraging him, come to Africa, join the congregation. There's so much to do. And I think, Marcel Lefebvre being such a, he was an energetic person. He was very generous. Anyone who reads his life will see that. And then he's eventually sent to Africa. And his first assignment is a seminary in Gabon, in Africa. And so he takes on this very difficult assignment, training African priests, because of course the focus already at that time is training a native clergy. And that's it begins with that, but that's pretty much the tenor of his work throughout his entire life, really, at that point. Whether it be seminaries, later he would be rector of the seminary in Morgon in France. That's after the Second World War. And of course, as bishop and later as apostolic vicar, really his whole purpose was, train native clergy and, place bishops, because of course they're creating all these dioceses all over Africa. It's just exploding. There's conversions everywhere. And so it's like, we need to create all these dioceses. We need to establish bishops everywhere, and we need to ordain priests. And so that is his work, is priests and bishops. That's what he does. So yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt. That's his, really from the beginning was his focus, for sure. Yeah.
So then when he retires, and again, we'll get into more history later, but we've seen the history of the Second Vatican Council. We've seen how all of these things changed, and he was ready to just retire and kind of just sit back and say, I'm kind of done. I mean, he'd given a life to the church. And then what happens in terms of his relationship to the priesthood?
Well, certainly he was no obscure prelate. He was well known, especially amongst conservative Catholics and priests and prelates at the time. And so, he's getting a lot of encouragement, and a lot of people are sort of reaching out to him, especially after his retirement. We can imagine they probably have very high hopes. But then he retires, and they think, well, there's this bishop, and he's 63 years old, and he's this staunch traditionalist. And so I think he has a lot of friends sort of encouraging him. And then, of course, he has actual seminarians who approach him, say, please help us. We're were basically drowning in this, the 60s atmosphere of seminaries in Europe at the time, which was just horrendous.
I worried a lot about the fact that it was now impossible for us to continue working and to have any certainty of reaching the priesthood, given the prevailing state of mind. I was led to ask the Archbishop to do something for us. Well, at the beginning, he has said to me, "I'll find you a bishop." And I remember having the audacity to say to him, "But Excellency, it's you that we want." He looked at me in amazement, and I myself was very much surprised by my having dared say such a thing to him, because I was 19 years old and was in philosophy. And to say to a 63-year-old bishop, "Excellency, it's you we want," was a little bit daring. But he said nothing, and then he said, "I'll think about it."
Yeah, so seminaries approach him, and so he says, "Well, I can't just abandon these young men. They're coming to me begging to me to help them." So he'll found a house of studies for seminarians in near Fribourg. So the University of Fribourg at the time, I believe, was run by the Dominicans. So certainly more Thomistic, and I think he trusted doctrinally what they were teaching, and he felt that would be a safe place for them. So basically the idea being that, okay, he would have a house for them to sort of just live a, community life, life of prayer and study, and then of course traveling to the university to take their classes and then come back and live this, sort of in this safe haven. Eventually it becomes clear that it's not really feasible. It's not something that you can continue. Not only because the classes themselves aren't quite as doctrinally sound as he had hoped, but I think as well because there's just more interest, or at least he foresees more interest, perhaps. And so it becomes clear that they need to open a full seminary with its own professors, its own staff, and so that's what sort of sets off the whole, really the establishment of the society as a congregation. And that's where he'll reach out to Bishop Charrière, a friend of his from his time in Africa, and under that bishop, he would establish the Society of St. Pius X in his diocese, and eventually you'd have the establishment of the seminary in Cone. But yeah, there's so much more that could be said about that. But yes, that is basically how it worked, and how it came to, really to have the SSPX as the SSPX today with its seminaries. Yeah.
In a nutshell, that's kind of how he started it.
Right.
We can see the work that he's done. We've talked in brief about some of the work that he's done. Something that I found interesting, and Father Reed, you gave a talk in St. Mary's last year for the 50th anniversary of the Society of St. Pius X. I think there were 5 lectures that were given in St. Mary's, and those are on YouTube on the St. Mary's YouTube channel, the Assumption Chapel YouTube channel. I'd recommend our listeners to go look those up. They're all very good. But I was listening to your talk that you gave, and this is kind of based on that. You talked about the Spiritan origins, the origins of the Holy Ghost Fathers, and I've read a lot about Archbishop Lefebvre. I've watched the documentary. I've read a lot of the history. I know all of this stuff, but I didn't. That was the first time I had seen the connection between the mission of the Holy Ghost Fathers, the mission of the Spiritans, and there's a lot of parallels there. So can you explain that a little bit for us, Father?
Yeah, it's very interesting. If you really want to understand, Archbishop Lefebvre, you do need to understand the Spiritan congregation. So a little history there. The Spiritans, the Holy Ghost Fathers, were founded in 1703 by a young seminarian, Claude Poulard des Places. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but in 1703 he was studying under the Jesuits in Paris, and he wanted to found a congregation for young seminarians, for maybe less financially poor seminarians, to help them to study and to be ordained. And he himself would 4 years later he would be ordained in 1707. And there would be a lot of young men, eventually priests, who would join this group. But interestingly, Claude Duplass died 2 years later. He became sick and he died very young. But nonetheless, the congregation continued to grow and to flourish. And really, I would say, and it's something that even, if you look at any of the, even just like go on the website of the Spiritan congregation, it's something they still insist on. This is idea of sort of like reaching out to poor and needy souls. And that, I think, is where the Spiritan congregation got is very missionary character. And because they would work through the Foreign Mission Society in Paris, and they would basically, these priests would go off to these new missions as the French Empire is expanding all throughout the world. They're sort of following this and converting and preaching and going, mainly to Africa, but elsewhere as well. There are Spiritan houses all throughout the world. It's a worldwide congregation. But interestingly, so the congregation grows and grows, but then the French Revolution happens. You have 1789, and of course it's persecution, chaos, and everyone is sent away. They're all dispersed, and in a way, it almost seems like a congregation is dead. It's done. But they sort of come back together. They reform. By the time the French Revolution happens, there was already 1,300 priests in the congregation. They all are dispersed, and it seems like maybe perhaps it's done. But it's in the middle of the 19th century. Interestingly, there's another character that's very important if you want to understand the Spiritans. It's Father Francis Lieberman. And he's sort of seen as sort of like the second founder. He himself had founded a congregation, the Society of the Holy Heart of Mary. And he was asked by the Vatican to combine his congregation with the Spiritan congregation. I think the idea being that they were just very similar. And that was in 1848. So this is the middle of the 19th century. And Father Francis Lieberman is another very interesting character as well, a Jewish convert. Became a priest. But so he would sort of re-infuse into the congregation the sort of like this renewed spirit. And that's where you really see the congregation growing rapidly, and really take on this very, missionary aspect. And so I would say by the time of Vatican II, I believe there's about 5,000 priests in this congregation. So it's among some of the largest congregations in the church. It's a big deal. And so when I was kind of preparing that talk for the conference, I wanted to find sort of some of the like original statutes, sort of the original founding, I guess, documents on the Spiritan congregation. I stumbled on a document. I don't believe they call them statutes, but it's like statutes, the rules or regulations of their congregation, their rule. And so when it talks about, what is their purpose, two things. It's, as I said, it's reaching out to souls most in need and abandoned souls. So I was getting this idea of going out to maybe like poorer countries or poorer people and reaching out to them, bringing them to faith, sort of like snatching them from the fires of hell. But then, interestingly, the principle, that's the goal. But then the principal means by which they're going to accomplish this is community life. And that's sort of a very interesting aspect of sort of what the Spiritan congregation is, or at least was, that sort of distinguishes them perhaps maybe from other missionary congregations. So yeah, reaching out to souls in need, sort of like missionary work, but then also doing it, having, sort of creating this sort of community of priests in these, different missionary countries. And that really sums up kind of like what the Spiritan congregation is. And that ultimately is going to be, pretty foundational for, what the Society of St. Pius X would eventually become.
And when you say that they're living in a community life, that's usually throughout church history, we see that much more in terms of monasteries, convents, the
right.
professed religious organizations or groups. They're the ones who live in these communities. And throughout history, parish priests sometimes lived alone. There would be one priest in one church and living in one place. And so throughout history, there's not really that community life, but this is something that's pretty distinct with the Spiritans.
Yeah, and I think it's actually especially because of their missionary work, they were going out to these, very far-flung regions.
Sure.
And in foreign countries, very harsh climates. It's very easy for someone in that position to become discouraged or even sick, or it's very difficult to continue that kind of work alone. Being a celibate man in the middle of the jungle by yourself, that's extremely difficult. You can imagine. So having other priests around you is crucial. And I think, especially in the past year and a half, I think we probably see now more than ever just how important it is for people not to be isolated. If we're living separately, living alone, locking ourselves up, it's really bad for us. We're not, that's not how God made us. You do, you lose your mind, you go nuts. Yeah. So it's that same idea, this very just natural principle, but applied to the priesthood. A priest, definitely he forms a community with his sheep, his flock, his parish. In the past, the priest would have access to other priests simply because the distance, wasn't really so great. You'd be able to walk to the next town in, a few minutes. And so even if you're in separate parishes, you can still have a certain relations and community with the other priests in the area. But with the advent of, modern transportation and the expansion of everything, it's, there's just much more separation. So you really need that. You need that community. Priests need other priests. That is really important. And I think it's sort of the thought of Archbishop Lefebvre. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, let's put a pin in that just for a second, and then let's transition over to the founding of the society. And in terms of the statutes, in your talk that you gave, you mentioned the statutes of the Society of St. Pius X are pretty small, or pretty, they're not very long. Some of their congregations are actually, really big.
Got them right here. Here it is. There's a statute. Look how thin it is. Here it is.
I mean, there's college football programs that have playbooks that are bigger than that.
Yeah.
So the statutes of the society, there's not much there. I mean, but what is there is very much very pithy. How does the experiences that we've seen Archbishop Lefebvre have, both in terms of overseeing priests and, like you said, the Spiritan upbringing, training, life, how does that transition over into the statutes of the society?
Yeah. So maybe I could just actually read for you just from the statutes. There's no don't go on Amazon, looking for the Kindle version of the. This is not a public document. It's not for anyone to just buy and read. So it is just for priests. We are given this when we enter the seminary, and we're expected to keep it and not distribute it. So it's not a public document, but I think certainly we can read from certain sections, especially if we want to talk about what's the purpose of the society.
Father Pagliarani is going to be emailing you in just a few minutes.
No, just one little paragraph. So, So, and it's actually something I've already said, but maybe two paragraphs. Okay. The title is The Purpose of the Society. The society's purpose is the priesthood and all that pertains to it, and nothing but what concerns it. That is, the priesthood as our Lord Jesus Christ willed it when he said, "Do this for commemoration of me." It's the first paragraph. And then I just want to jump right to the second paragraph, which I think is important too. The society must therefore orient the priest towards and have him concretize in his daily life what is essentially his raison d'etre, his reason for being, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, with all that it means, all that flows from it, and all that complements it. And that, in a summary, is that's what the society is about. It's about priests, and if you want priests and you want good, healthy priests, you need priests who are all about the Mass, which is what they're about. You cannot have priests without the holy sacrifice of the Mass. You can't separate them, basically. It's the idea. And I think that sort of goes into the importance of the Mass, and why society priests will and certainly should emphasize the importance of the Mass, making the Mass sort of the center of our spirituality, and seeing it not just as like another thing that Catholics do, but like this is the center of the Catholic life. Everything that, if you want to see the Catholic Church grow and blossom again, you need the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And it's something I described it in the conference I gave. And I think it's sort of, if you wanted like an image of what that is, it's so, of course, the center is Jesus Christ. He has to be the center. Jesus Christ is at the center. He's on the cross. It's Jesus Christ crucified, necessarily. And Christ crucified, that is what the Mass is. It's sort of the unbloody sacrifice of our Lord happening again on the altar. So the Christ on the cross is at the center, which is really the essence of the Mass. And the Mass is the reason for the priesthood, right? Priesthood and Mass are inseparable. And since the Mass is necessarily apostolic, it's not just a private prayer for me or, for this little group. It's meant to preach in a way. Therefore, there will be parishes, there will be schools, there will be all these other apostolates that, I would say the most visible aspect of what the Society of St. Pius X is. And that's often what people see. Most people, their first experience is, okay, I walk into usually a Mass center of the Society of St. Pius X, and I see, all these women in veils and babies everywhere, and Gregorian chant maybe, and the Latin Mass, and a priest there who travels, usually maybe drives a few hours or flies in and says Mass on the weekend for these people. That's what people see, but that's actually just like sort of like the end of the whole like thing, right? That's not like, I guess that's the expression of what the society does, but it actually runs much deeper than that. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say. So
you're not, the Society of St. Pius X does not exist to set up a bunch of Mass centers saying the Latin Mass everywhere. I mean, it does, but the whole reason, and this is something I learned some years ago, and it's one of those moments where you go, oh, when you understand it. The reason for the Society of St. Pius X's existence is the preservation of the Catholic priesthood.
Right.
Then once you have that, then everything else kind of flows from that.
Right.
Am I kind of explaining it right?
Probably that's it. And you're obviously not going to have just, okay, we make priests and look at these great priests. There they are. All right, just look at them. No. Well, what's a priest? Well, a priest is he's a shepherd. He's Christ. He's meant to give Christ the souls. So he has to do things. He has to preach. He has to educate and baptize and do what priests do. So. Right. But as I said, it is centered on the Mass, which is going to be, as long as he's faithful to his Mass, then he's going to live his priesthood authentically. That's kind of really what it comes down to. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we talked about this a little bit before, the congregation of priests that was part of that Spiritan tradition, and Archbishop Lefebvre brought that tradition, brought that experience that he saw into the Society of St. Pius X when he set up the SSPX those years ago. He wanted a strong emphasis on community life. Is that right?
No, absolutely. And that goes back to the regulations of the Spiritans. What is their means by which they will accomplish their apostolate is community life. And, I think maybe some of our faithful are probably familiar with this already, but, if you really want, if you want to see society priests, you want to be involved in the work of the society, really the sort of ideal place is going to be in what we call the priory. And that's just another name for the community where the priests live together, this community life. In the Spiritan congregation, the Spiritans took vows, so poverty, chastity, and obedience. And of course, all priests, even secular priests, take certainly an implicit vow of chastity, and they promise obedience to their superior, the bishop, on the day of their ordination. But one thing that Archbishop Lefebvre noticed, this is kind of an interesting detail, he noticed that, it was often difficult for some of the Spiritan missionaries to do their work because of their vow of poverty. Whether it be like building things or having bank accounts and such, they were often actually hindered by that. And it's interesting because it sounds kind of progressive, but he wanted to sort of establish sort of a different arm of the Spiritans where you had priests who were members of this congregation, but they didn't take the vow of poverty precisely for that purpose. And that's basically what society priests are. We are priests living in community who do not take religious vows. So that I would say is sort of like one of the key differences there. And it's something Archbishop Lefebvre had thought about and proposed, many years before when he was involved in the Spiritan congregation. But yeah, it's community life. And really, as long as priests are faithful to that, and I think we can all, as priests, we all have experienced that. Like, if we are faithful to our community life, going to community exercises, community prayers, being involved in the community, that communication with the superior, all those things that are involved in community life, which could be just a whole other series of episodes. But as long as the priest is doing that, he's going to be okay. He's going to be doing things right. And if he's straying, it's probably because he's not living that community life in some way or another. And that really, we know, we live it, like we see it every day. Like, this is kind of the genius of Archbishop Lefebvre, is like, this is what keeps us sane and stable and doing what we're supposed to do. And then, of course, if you understand community life, and that you have to sort of understand like the Benedictines and Western monasticism, it's liturgical, which means that like it's centered around the liturgy. That's really what the Benedictines are all about. They're a liturgical congregation, if you want to think of them in a way. And so what is the liturgy? Well, it's the Mass, and then of course the divine office and everything that sort of flows from that. So if you're going to talk about community life, you are necessarily going to talk about, yes, people living together, but you're also necessarily going to talk about liturgy and necessarily, of course, the Mass. And then that comes right back to what we're talking about, where, the Mass is the center of everything.
It's interesting. You often hear, and there's a lack of SSPX chapels throughout the United States and certainly throughout the world as well. And you often hear well-meaning people who are hungry for a chapel to be set up somewhere, and they look at somewhere like St. Mary's that has more than a dozen priests. They look at somewhere like Phoenix that has 5 priests. They look at all these priories, and they're like, why do you need 5 priests here? Why do you need 12, 14 priests here? Why do you spread them out, spread the wealth a little bit? But
right.
if you've read, The Soul of the Apostolate, if you've understood the fact that you have to have that interior life, that first before doing these works, then you understand why that community life is so important. And that's why the society is kind of set up like a hub, and then the priests travel. Well, isn't that a pain to travel every weekend? Yeah. But during the week, it's really important for you all to be together.
Right. No, exactly. That's it. Yeah, that's really what it comes down to. So, certainly, once again, there's that missionary aspect.
Sure.
We have to travel out, just like I'm sure, Archbishop Lefebvre and his priests had to go out into the bush. Well, we're not really going out into the bush. We're getting an air-conditioned car and driving a couple hours.
Depends on
but
where
still,
you're going, Father. But
it's true. Yes. And we do have priests in Africa and elsewhere, but the traveling is, I can't imagine. But there's the missionary aspect too, as well. Yeah, for sure. But once again, sort of coming back to that community, coming back to that stability, that foundation. Yeah.
And in your talk, and just to kind of close up, Father, you made a point in your talk before about making kind of a parallel between what the Society of St. Pius X is doing and what those medieval monasteries were doing. You mentioned the Benedictines and this community life, and I thought that was such an interesting point.
And that, ultimately, if you know history, even just a little bit, you know that, really Christendom was founded by these little communities of, really just Benedictines, monastics with their monasteries and their liturgy. And of course, they, all the sort of economics that has to go into sort of creating and keeping up a monastery. You have all these other people that sort of come and they sort of form this sort of community, sort of village, this town around these monastic communities. And really throughout all the Dark Ages and the barbarian invasions and all that, it survives and it grows and flourishes because of that. And that really is sort of foundational for, really sort of the pinnacle of Christendom, and you might say like the 13th century. It reaches that point because of those sort of little communities that began very small and, kept that faith and kept that culture alive and sort of gave birth to this, this sort of Catholic Western civilization, Christendom. Yeah. And also maybe just to add as well, and it's something I talked about in the 50th anniversary talk. I keep emphasizing, the Mass, and how Benedictines are liturgical. It means that, of course, their communities are centered around I forget what they call it, but the divine work, the work of the prayer, it's a liturgical prayer. The Mass is crucial for what we do. It really is our apostolate. It's the Mass. I think it was Archbishop Lefebvre who said, if a priest just saying his Mass in the morning already accomplishes 80% of his apostolate just by offering that sacrifice to God the Father. And that, our attachment to the Tridentine Mass, and, there's been podcasts on this already, but there's a reason for our attachment to the Tridentine Mass, doctrinally speaking, but also because of just what we do. Like, if we really are about the priesthood and about, keeping that priesthood healthy, our attachment to the Tridentine Rite, it's not an aesthetic preference. It's not just because we like it more or it's more beautiful, even if, it obviously is. But it expresses something that's perennial. The new Mass is, it really is, it's sort of just imbued with this sort of like this kind of watered down spirit of, late 20th century Christianity, a very specific time and place. And it's sort of stuck in that time. If you want to talk about a liturgy being stuck in time, the Latin Mass is not stuck in time, not at all. It's stretching back thousands of years. The new Mass, though, it's, you can't, how can something like that bear fruit? So, of course, doctrinally speaking, that's really sort of the foundation of that. But it's more than just a preference. Really, like, if we don't have the traditional rite, then we can't do what we do, really. That's really what it comes down to. It really is quite crucial. And Father Pagliarani, I think, explained that very well in his last letter about the Traditionis Custodes of Pope Francis. He hits on that perfectly. So, and of course, if anyone hasn't read that, of course, I encourage you to read that letter. It's really excellent. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, Father Reed, this has been fascinating to chat with you. I again appreciate your time, and it is great to kind of understand. Again, history is one thing, but we wanted to have this episode first just to kind of get more into kind of the philosophy or the reason behind the Society of St. Pius X and kind of what motivated Archbishop Lefebvre, and that helped. I'm going to throw a question at you that we haven't talked about, but if you could talk to Archbishop Lefebvre for a few minutes, what would you want to ask him, or what would you want to discuss?
It's interesting because, I've lived with priests who knew the Archbishop, who were not only just talked to him once or twice, but they were answering to him, and, he was their superior, and they all, they've all been clearly very marked by the man, it's something where he made a huge impression on them, of course. What would I ask Archbishop Lefebvre? It would be very interesting to get his take on what's going on right now. That would be fascinating, because the way the world is right now is really so vastly different to, the late 80s, early 90s when he passed away. Things have changed, and what would he say now? What would be his, I could guess, but yeah, it would be fascinating just to hear what his input would be on that. I would love to hear that. Of course it would be in the context of now. what his thoughts were on that, for sure.
Yeah. And hopefully he'd say, good job.
I hope so.
I'm sure he would.
Yeah.
Well, Father Reed, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it, and look forward to having you back on at some point in the future.
Yeah, no, this is great. I am not only am I, so today I'm on this podcast episode, but I am an avid listener of this podcast. So
very good.
I kind of feel like, on the game show, or like the person gets pulled out of the audience and like, hey, I'm like, oh, I'm on here now.
There's no suitcase full of money. Sorry.
I assign this as homework to my students. It's great. I love how you're doing this podcast. It's excellent.
Great.
So keep up the great work. It's wonderful. So.
Well, thank you, and thank you all the priests for doing it. So until next time, thanks, Father.
All right. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for listening to and watching episode 40 of our Crisis in the Church series here on the SSPX podcast. Next week, we are happy to welcome our first non-priest guest on this Crisis series, Mr. James Vogel. He's the communications director for the Society of St. Pius X, and over the last decade or so, has given many conferences on the history of the society. So next week, we'll look at that history, which has some very interesting parallels to today that we should be able to learn from. Please consider subscribing to the podcast and to the SSPX News English YouTube channel so that you won't miss next week's episode or any of our future episodes. And if you have the ability to set up a monthly recurring donation of $5 or $10 or $20 on sspxpodcast.com, it would help us immensely to complete this Crisis in the Church project. Until next week, thank you for listening, and God bless you.